Beauisafraid is the latest movie from Ari Aster, a filmmaker who rose to prominence in 2018 with the release of his psychological horror flick, Hereditary. The movie shattered box office expectations and proved to be an exceptionally well-made trip into hell. The following year, Aster released Midsummer, another psychological horror starring Florence Pugh. While Midsummer was not as universally beloved as much as his previous movie, it still garnered praise for its craftsmanship and its lead performance. And now we arrive at Beauisafraid, a project I've been interested in since its announced development. The idea of a director like Ari Aster teaming up with Joaquin Phoenix was a match made in heaven, and the fact that Aster described it as a comedy added a whole new layer of intrigue. And finally, after years of waiting, we get to see this ambitious piece on the big screen. The story is a relatively simple one. Kinda. A middle-aged man named Beau is attempting to return to his mother's home in a world that's a dark and surreal version of our own. Along the way, he encounters a bizarre cast of characters and gets into increasingly tense situations. That's about all I can reveal to keep things vague, but to tell you the truth, even if I did reveal specific events that occurred in the film, you probably would have way more questions. This is the kind of movie that you have to see for yourself to get the full picture. I know that the script has been making its rounds over the internet, but trust me when I say it only captures a fraction of the madness. Beauisafraid is a wholly unique cinematic experience that operates like a never-ending nightmare. Aster places us in the perspective of a man ridden with trauma, much like his other protagonists. We follow this man as he embarks on a strange odyssey that borders between Lynchian surrealism and downright farce. This is A24's most expensive production to date, with the budget totaling $35 million, and it absolutely shows. The quality of filmmaking here is spectacular, and there is one sequence in particular that had my eyes glued to the screen the entire time. I was a bit perplexed when I saw this movie was being used in IMAX theaters, but now I totally understand. Aster has this certain confidence that's rare for a fairly new director. With the exception of Robert Eggers, it's hard to find. He just makes these beautiful-looking films in a way that feels like he's been doing this for decades. Something else that this movie does quite well is keeping you in a constant state of anxiety. The protagonist suffers from numerous mental ailments, which makes his predicament even more difficult. This conundrum leads to some expertly crafted sequences that are full of tension. The goal is to place you in his shoes, and as someone who has anxiety, I'd say it does this to a really scary degree. This film recreates that feeling you experience in a bizarre dream. That feeling when you know your surroundings aren't quite right, but you can't place your finger on it, and the moment you realize how bad things are, you're unable to move. But despite boasting the same level of technical craftsmanship as Aster's other two films, I found Beauisafraid to be emotionally hollow and a bit of a narrative mess. This is definitely one of those films that will divide audiences down the middle, with some filmgoers that will love it and others who will be running from the theater. The screening I attended actually had 2 people leave before the movie's midpoint. The film clocks in at a hefty 3 hours, and I personally think you could easily shave off a solid 45 minutes. I appreciate the story committing to this wild odyssey, but there's a lot of fat that could be removed to achieve the same intended effect. And as the title of this video suggests, there's quite a bit of emotional baggage at play here. I hope someone's reached out to Ari Aster to see if he's okay, because there's some genuinely troubling things in this movie. Joaquin Phoenix's Beau is placed in several situations throughout his journey that each reflect his twisted family relationship, but despite all the emotional baggage, there's not a lot of depth to Beau himself. As always, Phoenix is delivering a great performance, and he seems to add substance to a character that lacks any found in the script. He's an inactive protagonist who is ushered along to different situations. I get that it's the point of the story, but for it to go on for 3 hours just gets tiresome, especially since it has this dreamlike feeling of wandering from sequence to sequence. Weird sidebar. This past weekend I watched 2 films I'd never seen before. Babylon, the latest flick from Damien Chazelle, and After Hours, a forgotten gem by Martin Scorsese. And in some weird cosmic way, I think I was destined to watch those 2 movies prior to seeing Beauisafraid, as I saw quite a bit of similarities between them all. In After Hours, we watch as Griffin Dunne undertakes a bizarre adventure to get home, in a way not entirely unlike Beau. The difference is, it's his incorrect decisions that lead him where he is. Beau is completely stagnant in his own story. And I bring up Babylon because it falls into the same trap of a director being granted total creative freedom at the detriment of the story they're trying to tell. I actually quite enjoyed Babylon, but Damien Chazelle's overindulgence into his own subject matter hindered rather than enhanced the experience. I feel this perfectly parallels with Ari Aster handling Beauisafraid. If only there were more people involved in the project who acted as devil's advocates, as he was biting off way more than he could chew. But these negatives are not to take away from the positives of the film. As stated before, the thing is technically beautiful, and the acting on display is top-notch. Patti LuPone, in particular, is absolutely stellar, and delivers a performance that I would call Oscar-worthy. There's one monologue in particular that had my skin crawling. But for me, it went on for way too long and got lost in itself. As the movie's credits rolled, I actually stuck around and spoke with the remaining audience members about how we all felt. It's rare for me to do that, but this thing is such an experience you can't help but turn to the person next to you and ask, well, WTF was that? We spoke for about 10 minutes, and even as things were starting to make a bit more sense, I still couldn't shake the feeling that it was ultimately emotionally flat. While I connected to some things, there were other things that just didn't work for me. But regardless, I'm glad that filmmakers are telling stories that encourage this kind of discourse. In a time where studios crank out CGI-laden products, it's nice to see creator-driven stories like this, even if they didn't completely resonate with me. And look, I get there's going to be huge fans of this, and that's great. I'm glad you were able to connect with it fully. For me, it was a beautiful but frustrating endeavor. I give Beauisafraid a C-.